Vanessa is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Jacques Cousteau National Estuary Research Reserve. So we're very fortunate to have something like that in our backyard to provide knowledge, but also as a real reserve that takes care of the beauty of nature. So without anything further, I'm just going to turn things over to Vanessa.
And good morning, everybody. So the idea behind this presentation is really that whether you're here, just for a weekend each summer or all year round, flooding impacts everybody. So today, I hope you'll get a better understanding of why flooding happens and also how you can minimize its impact. In the same vein, the coastal life is also kind of a puzzle made up of many complementary and diverse parts. There's something for everybody along our coastlines, and there's also constant change from season to season and day to day. One of those ever-changing things is, of course, flooding. So this is a photo of South 2nd Street in Surf City in October of 2018. I was on my way to work in the morning and I had to stop and get a picture because the flooding was so dramatic. Those of you who are on the island right now probably saw some of this type of flooding in the last week during the nor'easter. You'll note that in the photo, it's a sunny day. So we know the flooding isn't from the rain. So how does this happen? Flooding can occur for many different reasons, but one of the main reasons that we see on Long Beach Island is tidal flooding. And so every day, as I'm sure many of you know, there's 2 high tides and 2 low tides. Water flows in from the ocean into the bay, the tide goes up, it flows back out, back to the ocean, the tide goes down. So at low tide, the water's in the bay. We have a stormwater system in our streets consisting of stormwater drains where the water drains in and drains out to the bay. At low tide, this works just fine. As the tide goes up, the water can begin to build up through this stormwater system. If we get an especially high tide, like we did this past weekend, the water can come all the way up through the pipes and end up in the streets. And that's what we see in that photo I just showed in Surf City. Of course, we can also have a storm on top of that. And that's when we see really bad flooding, like in Sandy or other nor'easters where we have a storm surge on top of this high tide. Not only is the water coming up through the pipes, there's also nowhere for it to drain back out. Similarly, we can also have flooding from rain, especially if it's high tide in the bay and there's nowhere for the water to drain out. Luckily, when the low tide comes, the water can drain back out through the drains and the stormwater system is working as it should. So something I think a lot of people wonder is why do we have these drains in the first place if they're letting in the water and causing flooding? And the answer is that we need a stormwater system because of the patterns of development that we've created. When we have impervious surface like roads and driveways and patios, the water can't sink in through the ground, and so it needs to drain off to the roads and ultimately be channeled out to the bay by another means. In a large part, the flooding we see today happens because of the way we historically developed the land. So this is a topographic map from 1919. This is the entrance to the island. Here's a railroad that is today the Causeway Bridge, and this green star is that approximate location of the flooding photo in Surf City. What I want you to notice is this blue hashed area along through here. You can see there's kind of a shoreline, but the symbology on this map is showing us that that is an inundated area. It's basically just a wetland or a marsh. You'll note that as we look at the next year progression, jumping to 1952, there's been a lot more development. We have a lot more streets. There still is pretty profound marsh areas in this area of Surf City, but they have started to fill it in some areas for development. By 1973, you can see this purple line along the back edge of the island, showing that the entire thing has now been bulkheaded. They filled this area that was once marsh, and now it's developed. It's pretty much the same. By the 70s, it was pretty much the same development pattern that we see today. So if you think back to that 1919 map, we're looking at an area here that's very densely developed, lots of impervious surface, but it used to be wetlands. And so the reason in a large part that we see flooding is we no longer have those marsh areas that kind of work as nature's stormwater system. When it would rain before, the water would flow into the marsh. It can hold a lot of water. Or when the tide was coming in and the bay was getting high, the wetland buffers the dry areas of the island from development. Now we don't have that, and so there's nowhere for the water to go but up into the streets. So is flooding really getting worse? I think we observe a lot of times that it's getting worse and we hear that it's getting worse, but the answer is actually very complex. Sea level is rising, so in association, our flood levels are going to rise. Also, development and impervious surface is increasing, so stormwater runoff is getting worse. So together, those two things are in fact making flooding worse. But at the same time, communities have been making lots of upgrades and infrastructure improvements that can reduce flooding. So the answer is, in some locations, yes, the flooding is getting worse. And in other locations, maybe not, because there's been actions to adapt to the rising water. So how do we know sea level is rising?
You have to hear them too.
This is a graph of the Atlantic City tide gauge. It is the oldest operating tide gauge in New Jersey. And so it gives us a really good historic picture of what's happened over time. It began operation in 1911 and is still going today. And what we see is that over the past century, the rate of sea level rise has been about 4 millimeters per year, altogether an increase of about 1.35 feet over the last century. So this is how we know sea level is rising. It's not something that we're predicting or that we're modeling. It is truly the physical level of the water. We've been measuring it and we know it's going up. So what do we do about it? Well, you may have heard the term coastal resilience. It's kind of a buzzword these days, and the term describes the actions that governments and residents are taking to be prepared for the impacts of sea level rise and other coastal hazards. The idea is that if we take action now in advance of future storms and in advance of greater sea level rise, we'll be prepared to survive and thrive in the face of risks like that. And we describe this as not just bouncing back after a storm, not just recovering to the way we were before, but actually bouncing forward so that we are better off after a storm event due to the way we've prepared our built environment and prepared ourselves.